Summary of In the Lake of the Woods by Tim O'Brien. John and Kathy Wade are a married couple who are both in their 40s. John is a Minnesota politician who just lost a race for the U.S. Senate by a huge margin. He and Kathy are staying in a house near Lake of the Woods, which is a huge lake that runs through both Minnesota and Canada. Both of them are quietly sad, but they act like they're happy by talking about having kids and going to faraway places. There are parts in the book that are all about proof. In the first, we find out that Kathy Wade went missing while she was in Lake of the Woods. Several people, including Kathy's sister Patricia, say that something bad happened and that John may have been involved. We find out that John's father was a drunkard and that John's government career came to an end when people found out about his past. John loved his father, Paul Wade, when he was young. When John was 14 years old, his father killed himself. After that, John cried and had long talks in his head with his father, in which his father told John that he loved him. John and Kathy walk around Lake of the Woods on their last day together. They eat at a mini-mart, where they fight in front of a waiter named Myra Shaw. John seems to have unplugged the phone in his house so he doesn't have to think about losing the election. That night, he and Kathy don't make love. There are also pages with hypotheses about what happened to Kathy. In the first one, Kathy wakes up in the middle of the night and decides to leave John for a doctor she likes. In the next group of proofs, we find out that John fought in Vietnam, where he was called sorcerer. The narrator quotes biographers who say that all soldiers will never forget what it was like to be in war. When John was young, he loved to do magic tricks. Even in college, when he met Kathy, he played tricks on her by following her everywhere she went. He liked the feeling of being in control and the thrill of fooling other people. He told Kathy that he wanted to go into politics to help people, but in reality, he liked politics because he liked being able to control other people. John joins the army and spends 2 years in Vietnam. Kathy thinks that the only reason he does this is to improve his chances of being elected to office in the future. As sorcerer, he does tricks for the other soldiers, who think of him as good luck. When John goes back to the United States, he keeps following Kathy and finds proof that she was seeing someone else. But he still marries her. John thinks a lot of the time that he has to lie about what he did in Vietnam. The night before Kathy went missing, John woke up and said, "Kill Jesus," then went to boil water for tea. He used the hot water to kill a plant right away. He then boils more water and takes it to the bedroom. John can't remember what happens next, but he does remember going to the dock and maybe jumping into the lake. The next morning, he wakes up and realizes that Kathy isn't in bed with him. He goes back to sleep, though. The next idea about what happened to Kathy is that she ran away because John's actions that night scared her. So, she decided she couldn't help or feel sorry for John and got in the boat to get as far away from him as she could. As a child, John's father made fun of his size by calling him Jiggling John. Still, John's dad was a well-known person in his town, and many of John's friends wished he was their dad. John uses magic as a way to get away from his mean father. John does magic tricks for the troops in Vietnam. He also writes Kathy letters in which he says that their love is like two snakes that eat each other until there is nothing left. The narrator doesn't say why he shoots PFC Weatherby, another soldier. John then tries to convince himself that he didn't do anything wrong and that killing Weatherby was just a reflex. Back in the US, John runs for state senator in Minnesota and wins. But John has started yelling in his sleep, and Kathy can tell that he is keeping something from her about how he behaved in Vietnam. Still, she stays with him as her husband. John runs for lieutenant governor later on and wins. John thinks about how he will tell Kathy why he killed the plants on the day she goes missing. He thinks Kathy is out for a walk, so he drinks a lot while she's gone. Around 6 o'clock, he starts to worry that something is wrong, and then he realizes that the boat isn't in the dock. He goes to talk to Claude Rasmussen, the old, wealthy Democratic supporter who asked John and Kathy to stay in his cottage at Lake of the Woods. Claude and Ruth, his younger wife, feed John, and listen to him tell his story. He takes John back to his house, where the phone isn't plugged in. The storyteller quotes from books about magic. The suggestion is that magic is exciting because the audience knows it's not real but still wants to think it is. In the next chapter, the narrator talks about John's part in the 1968 killing at My Lai, which became famous around the world. John shoots an old Vietnamese man with a hoe, and he sees other troops, led by Lieutenant William Calley, kill women and children. The narrator thinks that Kathy left the house and went out on Lake of the Woods in the boat because she was afraid of her husband. Kathy might have hit a rock and drowned there. After John talks to Claude, the cops who are looking into Kathy's missing come to see him. Sheriff Arthur J. Lux says he voted for John and thinks Kathy is probably fine. Vincent Pearson, the other, doesn't trust John. He was also a soldier in Vietnam, and what he has read about John's actions there doesn't make him happy. John tells Kathy's sister Patricia to come to Lake of the Woods by calling her. The storyteller talks about what happened at the court-martial after the My Lai massacre. Soldiers say they were only doing what they were told or that they killed women and children to get back at their friends who had died. John stays in Vietnam for another year after the killing as a kind of punishment. He also changes his records to make it look like he wasn't at My Lai. When he gets back to the US, he runs for state senator. He hires Tony Carbo, a fat, experienced campaign manager who tells John to worry more about how he looks than about the problems. Tony seems to have a crush on Kathy, and he asks John if he has any dirt. Tony says he knows John is hiding something, even though John says he doesn't. Kathy tells John that she's pregnant at one point, but John tells her to get an abortion because it's not a good time for him to start a family. Even though she wanted kids, Kathy does this. The announcer also says it's possible that Kathy got lost. As she tried to find her way back to land, she may have thought about her own affair with a dentist named Harmon, which John finally found out about. She remembers a night she spent gambling with Tony in Las Vegas, when she felt full of hope. Later, when John lost his race for the Senate, Tony quickly joined the campaign of Ed Durkee, who won. Kathy was upset by this betrayal because she had thought of Tony as a friend. The narrator admits that Kathy might have been thinking about these things as she left John's house on the day she went missing. The narrator also thinks that Kathy might have killed herself by taking too much Valium. Before she died, she might have thought that she wanted more from life than John could ever give her. Patricia goes to Lake of the Woods after John calls her there. She doesn't believe John. Patricia tells John that Kathy was upset with him for keeping things secret, but John doesn't agree. In the next piece of proof, the narrator makes a lot of notes in a footnote that show he was also a soldier in Vietnam. He won't say that the soldiers at My Lai were guilty, but he also says that people are inherently bad and can do bad things. He also says that the sunlight was what caused the men to act the way they did. After the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, Lieutenant Calley tries to scare his soldiers into not talking about their war crimes. Richard Thinbill, a soldier who hasn't killed anyone at My Lai, asks John what he did wrong, and John says that he shot 2 people. John laughs so hard that he can't breathe, and Thinbill tells him to keep laughing, saying that being honest is the best strategy. Thinbill says that John, who he only knows as sorcerer, killed 2 men at the court-martial. During John's bid for the Senate, Ed Durkee finds this information and tells the press about it. This hurts John in the Senate race. In Lake of the Woods, Claude, Patricia, and John look for Kathy on the water. Patricia criticizes John for not caring at all about Kathy, which Claude and Patricia agree with. Later, John gets into a fight with Vincent Pearson. He can tell that everyone is starting to think that he killed Kathy. That night, he takes off his clothes and jumps into the cold water of Lake of the Woods. He does this because he thinks he's just as bad as his father, who killed himself when John was 14 years old. Then he thinks of Kathy's eyes and pulls himself out of the water. 2 weeks later, John gets a call from Sheriff Lux. He tells him that all the boats that have been looking for Kathy have come up empty. After that, Claude tells John that the cops are going to dig around his house because they think John killed Kathy and buried her there. In the next piece of proof, it's suggested that John's father taught him to be sneaky and to like to manipulate people. Ruth and Eleanor both say that the narrator is concerned with figuring out what happened to Kathy. In a footnote, the narrator admits that he is obsessed with finding out what happened to Kathy, but he says that the puzzle of her disappearance is more beautiful than any one answer. The person telling the story says that John may have killed Kathy by pouring hot water on her face and then putting stones on her body in the lake. John drives north in a boat that Claude gave him. He reads Claude's letter, in which Claude tells him to go to Canada to start over. It turns out that John went missing around the same time that Kathy did, and different people say that it's possible that he and Kathy are still alive and living somewhere together. The narrator thinks that he'll never figure out what happened to Kathy and John. Still, he wrote the book to talk about his own views of Vietnam, which don't vary much from John's. He says that since there isn't just one answer to the question, the best thing to do is come up with the happy answer. So, he thinks that John and Kathy faked their disappearance, got back together later, and are now starting over somewhere. In the end, the narrator says that John was a man, not a monster, and that he did nothing wrong other than live his own life.
About the author. Tim O'Brien was born in 1946 in the Minnesota town of Austin, but he spent most of his childhood in the nearby town of Worthington. As a child, he was very interested in nature and travel, which are also common themes in his books and short stories. O'Brien went to college to study politics. Soon after he graduated from high school in 1968, he was sent to Vietnam to serve in the army for almost 2 years. O'Brien was part of the famous section that was involved in the My Lai massacre, but he didn't get to Vietnam until almost a year after this happened. After his time in the war, he went to Harvard University to study writing. In 1973, he published his first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, which was a biography. The book has been called the best book ever written about Vietnam. It has been praised by a small but impressive number of critics. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, O'Brien kept writing books and short stories, such as Going After Cacciato. Most of these stories were about or made references to the Vietnam War. In the 1980s, he also worked for better care for military soldiers and spoke out against the U.S. military's actions abroad. The Things They Carried, the book for which O'Brien is best known, came out in 1990. The book was a collection of short stories about Vietnam, many of which O'Brien had written and released in the 10 years before. It got a lot of praise and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Since 1990, O'Brien has written 3 books, In the Lake of the Woods, Tomcat in Love, and July, July.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.